Dust swirled in the air as Captain Elias Kane stepped cautiously through the ancient alien temple, his boots crunching over loose debris. The dim glow of his flashlight illuminated the towering stone walls, etched with carvings of gods and celestial events. Strange symbols twisted and spiraled across the surfaces, their meanings lost to time. The air was thick with the scent of decay and something olden, something untouched for centuries. Every step echoed eerily in the cavernous chamber, amplifying the silence that clung to the ruins like a warning. Kane adjusted his grip on his pulse pistol, the weight of it reassuring as he scanned his surroundings. The temple had been built to last, but time had taken its toll. Cracks marred the intricate designs, and chunks of stone had collapsed into uneven piles. He had been in countless ruins before, but this place felt different. He wasn't just walking through history. He was trespassing on something meant to stay undisturbed. A faint humming noise made him pause. He swept his flashlight across the vast chamber, revealing rows of ancient statues lining the walls. Their faces were humanoid but elongated, their expressions unreadable. Their eyes, once likely polished gemstones, were now dull and lifeless. But as Kane took another step forward, the humming grew slightly louder, almost as if the ruins themselves were waking up. He exhaled slowly, brushing dust from a nearby panel embedded in the stone. The craftsmanship was intricate, delicate even, far beyond what most civilizations had achieved at the time these ruins were abandoned. His fingers traced over the alien symbols, his mind working to decipher their meaning. And like the carvings on the walls, these weren't decorative. They were instructions. A warning, maybe, or a lock. Kane pulled a small datapad from his belt, activating the scanner. The device flickered, struggling to process the readings. Whatever this place was, it emitted a strange energy signature, something the scanner wasn't built to handle. He frowned, adjusting the settings, but before he could take a proper reading, a deep, mechanical groan rumbled through the chamber. Dust cascaded from the ceiling, and the very ground beneath him trembled. Instinctively, Kane took a step back, raising his pistol as the massive vault door before him shifted. The sound of grinding stone and ancient mechanisms unlocking filled the chamber. He hadn't touched anything. Had he triggered it just by being here? He tightened his grip on his weapon, pulse quickening as the door slowly pulled apart, revealing a chamber beyond bathed in eerie golden light. The relic was at the center of it all. It rested atop an ornate pedestal, pulsing faintly, as if alive. And like the rest of the temple, the artifact looked untouched by time. Its surface was smooth and metallic, shimmering with energy that Kane had never seen before. The carvings along the pedestal depicted figures reaching toward it in reverence, their faces twisted in awe or terror. He couldn't quite tell. Kane took a cautious step forward, every instinct screaming at him to be careful. He had found relics before, priceless artifacts from lost civilizations, but nothing like this. This wasn't just a piece of history. This was power. And power never sat unguarded. He swept the flashlight around the chamber, looking for signs of traps, defenses, anything that might have been designed to keep intruders at bay. The carvings on the walls here were different from the ones in the outer chamber. These showed destruction, worlds burning, cities crumbling, beings consumed by the same golden energy that pulsed from the relic. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't just valuable. It was dangerous. He crouched, activating his scanner again, hoping to get a better reading. But just as before, the device flickered and failed, unable to process the energy signature. Kane muttered a curse under his breath. He didn't like taking chances with things he didn't understand, but he hadn't come all this way to leave. The air felt heavier as he stepped closer. The humming sound intensified, vibrating through the very stone of the temple. He reached out hesitantly, fingers hovering just above the relic's surface. A static charge pricked his skin, and a sharp pulse of energy rippled through the room. Then the sound of shifting rubble made him freeze. Kane barely had time to react before a laser bolt shot past his head, scorching the temple wall. He dove behind a fallen pillar, heart pounding as the echoes of the blessed faded. From the shadows near the entrance, a familiar voice rang out, laced with amusement. "Step away from the prize, Kane." "Vex." Kane exhaled sharply, shaking his head. Of course, she had followed him here. The rival relic hunter stepped into the golden light, her cybernetic eye glowing faintly as she surveyed the chamber. Behind her, a group of heavily armed mercenaries spread out, weapons trained on him. "Didn't take you for a history buff, Vex," Kane said, keeping his pistol close. She smirked. "History pays well." Kane's mind raced. He was cornered, outgunned, and standing in front of an artifact that had just given off enough energy to suggest it wasn't just a simple relic. Worse, something in the air had changed. The humming had stopped. The temple had been reacting to his presence before, but now, it was reacting to something else. As Merx moved into position, the temperature in the room seemed to drop. A low, resonant vibration started up again, but this time, it wasn't coming from the relic. Kane glanced toward the carvings once more, his stomach twisting as he realized what they had been trying to warn him about. Kane's breath came slow and steady as he assessed his options. Vex and her mercenaries had him pinned, weapons trained, ready to take him down the moment he made a wrong move. The golden glow from the relic pulsed in rhythmic waves, casting shifting shadows along the ancient chamber walls. But Kane wasn't just worried about the guns pointed at him. Something else had changed in the air, a subtle but undeniable shift, as if the temple itself had noticed the intrusion. The carvings along the walls weren't just decoration. They were warnings. And now that the relic had been disturbed, Kane had the sinking feeling they were about to find out exactly why. Took a confident step forward, her cybernetic eye scanning the relic with growing intrigue. "This is different from your usual scavenger finds, Kane," she mused. "Didn't peg you for a gambler, but here you are, about to risk your life over something you don't even understand." She motioned to her crew without taking her eyes off him. "Step away. Now." Kane let out a slow exhale, calculating. The mercs were seasoned professionals, and wasn't one to take chances. If he played this wrong, he'd be dead before he hit the ground. But if he let them take the relic, they'd be carrying out something that might be better left buried. The humming in the air deepened, reverberating in his chest like a drum beat. Dust sifted down from the ceiling, and the ground beneath them gave a subtle but undeniable tremor. The temple was reacting. Kane's gut told him that this was about to go very, very wrong. "You might want to rethink touching that thing, Vex," Kane said carefully, inching his fingers toward his belt, where a small energy grenade rested. "You ever think about why no one's come back from these ruins?" Smirked. "Oh, I've thought about it. But unlike you, I came prepared." She nodded to one of her mercs, a heavily armored brute who approached the relic with slow, measured steps. As soon as he reached out, Kane felt something shift. The temple let out a low, guttural groan. The carvings along the walls pulsed faintly, the golden light from the relic flickering like a dying fire. Then the humming stopped altogether, plunging the chamber into eerie silence. Kane held his breath. Even hesitated, her hand twitching near her holster. Then the first scream echoed through the chamber. The merc reaching for the relic suddenly convulsed, his body jerking violently. His armor cracked apart as an unseen force lifted him off the ground. He barely had time to choke out a strangled gasp before his entire form collapsed inward with a sickening crunch, as if the air itself had crushed him like a tican. His lifeless body hit the floor with a hollow thud. Chaos erupted. The mercenaries snapped their weapons in every direction, barking orders, scanning for an unseen attacker. Kane pressed himself against the nearest pillar, his pulse hammering as he tried to process what just happened. Smirk was gone, replaced by a sharp, calculating stare as she assessed the growing threat. Then the shadows moved. From the farthest reaches of the chamber, figures began to emerge, tall, beings with elongated, emaciated limbs and hollow, glowing eyes. They drifted forward with unnatural fluidity, their very presence distorting the air around them. The temperature dropped even further, and Kane could see his breath fog in the cold. Mercs opened fire. Plasma bolts tore through the chamber, striking the figures. But the shots passed through them as if they were mist, dissipating into nothing. The creatures barely acknowledged the attack, their hollow gazes fixed on the living intruders. Kane gritted his teeth. This wasn't a tomb for the dead, it was a prison. And they had just opened the door. Fired her own weapon, a plasma repeater that had taken down more than a few heavily armored targets in her time. The shot struck one of the wraiths directly in the chest, flaring brightly for a brief moment before vanishing into the void. The creature didn't flinch. Instead, it raised a skeletal hand, and a pulse of invisible energy lashed out. Barely managed to dive aside as the pillar behind her exploded into rubble. "Move! Fall back," she barked, her usual calm demeanor breaking under the weight of the moment. Her mercs scrambled, but the wraiths moved faster, gliding through the chamber like specters of death. When Merc barely had time to turn before a creature reached out and passed a translucent hand through his chest. The man gasped, shuddering violently before collapsing, his face frozen in an expression of silent horror. Kane knew they couldn't fight this. He didn't know what these things were, but they weren't bound by the same rules of physics as the living. They needed to run. "The relic!" snapped, turning her eyes toward Kane. "It's the trigger. We need to put it back." Kane wasn't sure if that was true, but they didn't have time to debate. He sprang forward, dodging between fallen pillars as more of the wraiths emerged from the darkness. He reached the pedestal and hesitated only for a fraction of a second before grabbing the relic. The moment his fingers made contact, the chamber erupted with energy. A violent pulse exploded outward, sending both Kane and flying backward. The wraiths shrieked in unearthly tones, recoiling from the surge of power. Kane hit the ground hard, his vision spinning as he struggled to breathe. Through the haze, he saw the wraiths hesitating, their forms flickering and unstable. The relic's glow intensified, as if it were actively pushing them back. Kane gritted his teeth, pushing himself up despite the searing pain in his ribs. Still winded, met his gaze with an unspoken understanding. They had to get out before the temple sealed them inside. "Run," Kane muttered, shoving the relic into his satchel. "Now!" Together, they sprinted toward the entrance as the temple rumbled in protest. The walls began to cave, pillars crumbling under the strain. The wraiths screeched, unable to pass the threshold of the relic's energy. The moment Kane and burst into the open air, the entire structure collapsed behind them, sealing the horrors within once more. Kane lay on his back, gasping for breath, staring at the stars above. Coughed, sitting up beside him. "Hell of a find, Kane." The wind howled across the desolate expanse of the planet's surface, kicking up clouds of dust that shimmered under the pale glow of the distant star. Kane adjusted his breathing mask and, the satchel slung over his shoulder, where the relic pulsed with an eerie golden light. It had been hours since they escaped the collapsing temple, but his nerves hadn't settled. Something about the way the wraiths recalled when he touched the relic gnawed at the back of his mind. He wasn't sure if they had survived by chance or if something more sinister was at play. Vex marched beside him, her usual air of unshakable confidence slightly rattled. The mercenary leader had seen a lot in her years, but even she had been shaken by what they had encountered. Behind them, the remnants of her crew struggled to keep up, their numbers thinned by the massacre inside the ruins. Their ship was still a few kilometers away, hidden in a ravine that had once been a riverbed, but Kane knew they weren't safe yet. "There's something wrong with that thing," finally spoke, her voice tight. "You feel it, don't you?" Kane nodded, fingers tightening around the satchel strap. "Yeah. And I think we pissed off something ancient." One of the surviving mercenaries, a grizzled veteran named, grunted. "Ancient or not, we barely got out of there alive. Whatever that thing is, it isn't worth dying over." Shot him a glare. "It's worth whatever I say it is." Kane wasn't in the mood for their usual power struggle. We need to focus on getting off this rock first, he said. We're exposed out here. As if in answer, the ground trembled beneath them. Kane froze, exchanging a wary glance with. A low rumble carried across the wind, and for a moment, he thought it was just another quake from the temple's collapse. Then he heard it, an unnatural clicking noise, like massive claws scraping against stone. Immediately raised a fist, signaling the others to stop. Weapons were drawn, safeties disengaged. Kane slowly turned toward the source of the sound, his pulse hammering. From the rocky ridges ahead, movement stirred. Shadows slithered between the jagged formations, shifting unnaturally fast. The dust cloud that had been carried by the wind suddenly stilled, as if something enormous was disturbing the air itself. Then, out of the haze, they appeared. Kane had thought the wraiths inside the temple were terrifying. But what emerged from the rocks was something worse. Towering figures with exoskeletons, their elongated limbs ending in claws, moved with eerie precision. Their eyes were cold, featureless orbs, and their bodies seemed to phase in and out of visibility, bending light around them like living mirages. Vex, tell me you have a plan, Kane muttered, slowly reaching for his pistol. Jaw tightened. We ran. The lead creature let out a piercing shriek that echoed across the landscape. The others responded in kind, their bodies shifting as they prepared to charge. Kane didn't need any more encouragement. He turned and sprinted. Blaster fire erupted behind him as the mercs opened up with everything they had. But the creatures were fast. Too fast. Kane risked a glance over his shoulder and saw one of the mercs get caught, a appendage slicing through his armor like paper. The man barely had time to scream before he was lifted into the air and torn apart. The ship was still too far. Kane gritted his teeth, pushing his legs to move faster. The relic in his satchel pulsed more intensely now, as if reacting to the presence of the creatures. Was it drawing them in, or was it trying to warn him? A shadow loomed to his right. Another of the creatures lunged, claws raised for a killing strike. Kane barely managed to duck, rolling into a crouch and firing off a shot from his pistol. The plasma bolt struck the creature's carapace but barely slowed it down. It shrieked in irritation rather than pain. Was already moving before Kane could react. She skidded to a stop, raising a modified grenade launcher and firing a concussive blast. The explosion tore through the air, sending dust and debris flying. The creature was knocked back, but it was already regaining its balance. They don't go down easy. Shouted. No kidding. Kane shouted back, sprinting toward a rocky outcrop for cover. The others followed, ducking behind the boulders as the creatures regrouped. Their shrieks filled the air, a chorus of nightmare sounds that made Kane's skin crawl. This is bad, panted. We're boxed in. Kane's mind raced. If they stayed here, they were dead. But the ship was still out of reach. His eyes darted to the relic in his satchel. It had repelled the wraiths in the temple. Maybe, just maybe, it could do something here. He unzipped the satchel and pulled the relic free. The moment his fingers made contact, a surge of energy pulsed outward. The creatures recoiled, hissing in pain, their shimmering forms distorting like static interference. Kane saw the opportunity. Cover me, he yelled, stepping forward with the relic raised high. The pulsing light intensified, sending shockwaves through the air. The creatures shrieked louder, their bodies flickering like candle flames in the wind. Didn't hesitate. She and the remaining mercs laid down covering fire, keeping the creatures at bay as Kane advanced. The light from the relic expanded, forming a shimmering barrier between them and their attackers. The creatures clawed at it but couldn't break through. Kane felt his strength draining, as if the relic was pulling energy from him. His vision blurred, his grip weakening. But he couldn't stop now. He forced himself forward, step by step, until the ship finally came into view. Grabbed him by the arm, practically dragging him the last few meters. Get him inside, she barked to her crew. The ramp of the ship lowered, and they stumbled inside just as the barrier faltered. The creatures shrieked in frustration, but they didn't cross into the ship's threshold. Kane collapsed onto the cold metal floor, gasping for breath. Slammed the ramp controls, sealing them inside. Get us off this rock. Now! As the engines roared to life and the ship lifted off, Kane clutched the relic to his chest, his mind reeling. They had escaped again. But something told him this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The hum of the ship's engines filled the dimly lit cargo hold as Kane sat slumped against the cold metal wall, the relic still clutched in his hands. Every muscle in his body ached, and exhaustion threatened to drag him into unconsciousness. But his mind refused to quiet. The events of the past hours replayed over and over, escaping the collapsing temple, the relentless pursuit of the creatures, and finally, the desperate sprint to the ship. Even now, as they soared through the upper atmosphere, he didn't feel safe. Something was still out there, watching, waiting. Pieced near the control panel, arms crossed tightly, her jaw set in frustration. The others, what remained of them, sat in silence, tending to their wounds. Had taken a deep cut to his shoulder, but he waved off medical attention, instead choosing to stare at the relic with narrowed eyes. It sat in Kane's lap now, no longer glowing as intensely as before, but its presence was still unnerving. That thing almost got us killed, finally muttered, breaking the silence. Twice. Kane exhaled sharply, shifting his grip on the artifact. It also saved us. Twice. Eyes darkened. If you hadn't grabbed it in the first place, we wouldn't have needed saving. Kane met her glare but didn't respond. He knew she was right. Whatever power the relic held had drawn those creatures to them like moths to a flame. But he also knew they couldn't just leave it behind. He had spent years hunting for ancient artifacts, uncovering lost histories, but nothing he had ever found had felt like this. It was more than just a relic. It was a key to something greater, something terrifying. A loud beep from the console made turn sharply. The ship's systems were struggling to stabilize. Warning lights flickered, and a deep, rumbling vibration rolled through the hull. Kane pushed himself to his feet, ignoring the burning protest of his muscles. What now? Fingers flew across the controls, scanning the readouts. Her expression darkened further. Something's messing with our systems. It's like we're caught in a gravity well, but there's nothing in our flight path. Groaned, rubbing his temple. Oh great. More bad luck. Kane frowned. He looked back down at the relic, unease creeping up his spine. It was pulsing again, faintly, in sync with the strange vibrations in the ship. He swallowed hard. I don't think this is bad luck. Before anyone could respond, the ship lurched violently to the side, throwing them all against the walls. The artificial gravity flickered, making their stomachs twist as the ship spiraled uncontrollably. Alarms blared across the cabin. We're being pulled off course. Shouted over the chaos, gripping the console to steady herself. Kane fought his way back to the relic, his mind racing. He could feel it now, a force, something unseen, something ancient. It wasn't just an artifact. It was active. It was guiding them. The ship suddenly stabilized with a jarring halt, as if an invisible hand had caught it. Outside the vastness of space stretched endlessly, yet something was different. A planet loomed below, when that hadn't been on any of their charts. Its surface was shrouded in swirling violet storms, and at its poles, immense structures glowed like beacons. Face was pale. That planet wasn't there a second ago. Kane barely heard her. The relic in his hands was humming louder now, and for the first time, words echoed in his mind. Not in a language he understood, but in feelings, in ancient whispers. A calling. A warning. This isn't a planet, he murmured, realization settling in his bones like ice. It's a construct. Scoffed. A construct? You mean, like some kind of? Kane nodded, fingers tightening around the relic. And we weren't just pulled off course. We were summoned. A cold silence followed his words. The ship's sensors flickered erratically, unable to fully scan what lay beneath them. But Kane could feel it. This place was old, older than the Dominion, older than any known civilization. It had been waiting. Inhaled sharply and turned toward him. Tell me we can leave. Kane hesitated. That was the question, wasn't it? Could they leave? Or were they meant to be here? The relic had brought them, and something deep inside him whispered that it wouldn't let them go so easily. Then, the ship's communications crackled to life. A voice, low, distorted, and impossibly vast, spoke in a language none of them recognized. The relic flared brightly in response, and Kane felt the words resonate inside him like an ancient song. The message was clear. You have come for knowledge. But are you ready for truth? The ship trembled as if the very fabric of space was shifting around them. Kane swallowed hard and looked at, whose grip on her weapon had tightened. He had chased relics his whole life, uncovering secrets buried by time. But this was different. This wasn't just history. This was something alive. And it had been waiting for someone like him.